thing here. Okay, tell me if you see the PowerPoint slide on the screen.
Election of the president.
Okay. So we're going to continue with this discussion today that we started on Tuesday on the election of the president. Remember, some of the things that we talked about last time apply generally to elections, but mainly we were focused on the particulars of the presidential election process. So I'm not going to go back through all the detail again that we did last time, but let me just highlight a couple of things. We started by saying that the election of the president, as with the election of U.S. senators or members of the House of Representatives or governors or any other office that's elected on a partisan basis. What does that mean when I say the office is elected on a partisan basis?
Either Republican or Democrat.
So the candidates in the general election, the candidates for that office, if it's president or senator or whatever the office is, are running as nominees of a political party. So typically in our system, we focus on the Democratic Party's nominee and the Republican Party's nominee, but most of you are probably aware that in many elections, there may be a Libertarian Party candidate, there may be, some other third party candidate. For example, were there any third party candidates in the most recent presidential election? Yeah, there were. In fact, there were a bunch of them. Okay, it wasn't just Donald Trump, the Republican, and Joe Biden, the Democrat, right? But because we have a dominant two-party system, it's natural then and perfectly understandable for us to focus on those two major parties. Okay. At any rate, that's what I mean when I say that the office is elected on a partisan basis. What would be an example of an office? Who can remember last time? I remember mentioning this, but I didn't make a big deal about it. Give me an example of an office that is elected by voters that's not on a partisan basis.
School board.
Sure, good. Got two people who picked up that one, right? So the members of the Lamar Consolidated Independent School District, the board, right, or the Fort Bend Independent School District board, they don't run as Democratic Party candidates or Republican Party candidates. We could have also mentioned there in Texas, it's certainly true, and in many other parts of the country, it's true, mayoral candidates don't run as Democrats or Republicans. Now, I didn't mention this to you last time. I'll go ahead, since I'm thinking about it, I'll throw it in here now. Even though, for example, let's pick, everybody knows, I bet most people in here know who the mayor of Houston is, even if you don't know who the mayor of Sugar Land is, or the mayor of Richmond, or whatever city you're in, okay? Somebody just put it out there. Who's the mayor of Houston? Sylvester Turner. Good. That's a game, because obviously we got the major media market here in Houston. They're going to focus on the Houston mayor as opposed to some of the other smaller cities, right, in the area. At any rate, do any of you have a sense of which political party Sylvester Turner is affiliated with? Nobody?
I guess it.
No, he's a Democrat. Okay, Sylvester Turner is a Democrat. Before he was mayor, he served in elective office. He was a member of the Texas legislature, which is a partisan-based office. They do run as nominees of political parties. He's a Democrat. But everybody in Houston pretty much knows that Sylvester Turner is a Democrat. Okay? Even though when they go to vote in the election, now he's not eligible to stand for election again, I don't think. I think the term limits that are applied to Houston's mayor will apply to him. But certainly when he stood for re-election last time and voters went to the polls and they voted for either Sylvester Turner, anybody remember who his opponent was? His name's been in the news again here recently because of the Deshaun Watson issue, right? Tony Buzbee, the lawyer Tony Buzbee was his main opponent, right? Everybody kind of knew that Sylvester Turner was a Democrat, right? Even though you don't see Democrat on the ballot, okay? Most people knew. Now, in some cities in the United States, mayors do run as party nominees. Major cities like New York or Chicago or Los Angeles, they do run as party as the nominee of a political party. Okay, so for example, Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York, when voters in New York City go to vote for mayor, they see Bill de Blasio, Democrat. Right? So at that level, at the local level, it really just depends on what part of the country you're talking about. Okay, don't want to digress too much more on that. Again, if it is a partisan-based election, then it's going to have two phases. The first phase is the nomination phase. That's the process that the parties go through to narrow down a field of candidates to just one, a nominee, who's going to run in the general election against the opposition party's candidate. Okay? And then the other thing we said that is particular to presidential elections is that both of these phases, both the nomination phase and the general election, are representative processes. Who remembers what that means? And I say,
They're not, the individuals aren't voting for the person itself, they're voting for a delegate.
which individuals are we talking about?
The normal people running for the appointments, presidential.
The voters.
Yeah, that's what maybe that's what you meant by that. Yeah, well, all I'm really trying to get you to understand is that ordinary voters, and I can include myself in that category, right? I'm just an ordinary voter. At no point do we actually cast a ballot directly for a presidential candidate. Not in the nomination process. In the nomination process, we're actually casting ballots for delegates to a national convention who are pledged to that candidate. And then in the case of the general election, which we're going to get to today, we're actually voting for a slate of electors who, again, are, for the most part, politically committed to vote for that candidate. Okay? So that's what I mean when I say representative processes. All right? Now, again, we went through some detail here last time. This nomination process, the first phase, I think it's handy to sort of think about it as having two components. The first is the series of state-by-state primaries and caucuses. We distinguished last time between primaries and caucuses. Not going to do that again. We noted that it varies substantially from state to state. It varies from one presidential election year to the next. It varies between the political parties. All right? So it's really difficult to say a whole lot of a general nature, except for the major point, which is whatever process a state uses in this year or that year or whichever political party it is that we're talking about, what it all has in common is that they're selecting delegates to a national convention. That's technically what's happening in these primaries and caucuses. And so we refer to these as presidential preference primaries and caucuses. Okay? Remember we made this distinction last time, right? So all other offices that are elected on a partisan basis use a direct primary, which means that the vote that you cast for candidate A is actually directly a vote cast for candidate A. There's no proxy involved, like essentially you've heard that term before, I'm sure, right? That's essentially what's happening in the presidential process when you vote for delegates to a national convention, whether you're aware of it or not. You all are going to be aware of it for 2024 moving forward. You're going to know that what you're actually voting for are delegates, even if you don't see their names on the ballot. Right? They have your proxy, so to speak, right? So that when they go to that national convention, they are voting on your behalf for whatever candidate is that you support. I think we had gotten a little bit into this at the end of the class period last time, right? We had started this, right? Whether we're talking about a direct primary or presidential preference primary. Oh, let me throw this in here real quick too, because I don't think I mentioned this last time and I really should. I think this is an important point. The direct primary is a process that it's about 100 years old, okay? I think the first direct primary was in the United States was held in Wisconsin in 1914, somewhere around in there, about 100 years, a little over 100 years ago, okay? And it was part of the progressive reform movement. Have any of you taken the American history course? I guess it would be the second one. where you learn about the progressive reform movement? Remember learning about those antitrust laws, for example? The progressives in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, there's a lot we could say about that movement, but I think one of the main things that we can say about that movement is that they were interested, the progressives were interested in breaking up monopoly power. Okay? And that included both economic monopoly as well as political monopoly. Okay? So in the same way that they were trying to break up the power of the big corporations that were trying to form trusts and so on in this sector of the economy or that sector of the economy, they were also interested in breaking up what they perceived as the monopoly power of the political bosses. This is also the same era, maybe you learned in that same American history course about the boss system. And, many American cities, for example, or many places around the United States where you had these so-called political bosses that monopolized political power, and they doled out, this or that based on patronage. The progressives were interested in wresting political power away from the party bosses, and the direct primary was one means that they saw of doing that. In other words, they were going to take control of this very important function of political parties, nominating candidates to run for office. They were going to take that out of the hands of the party bosses and put it in the hands of the rank and file members of the party. It was a democratizing, in their perception, it was a democratizing lowercase d feature, right? Make the system more democratic, they believe, right? So once Wisconsin did that in, I think it was 1914, I could be wrong about the exact year, but it was somewhere in that period, okay? Within the next 20 years, by the 1930s, almost every state in the country was using a direct primary. That's how quickly that idea caught on, okay? Before that, before the direct primary, as I kind of hinted a moment ago, nominations for this office or that office were in practice largely handed out on the basis of patronage by the party bosses. Technically, it might have been done in a convention, okay? By the time we get to the 1940s, most of the states are holding presidential preference primaries, selecting delegates to the national convention in that manner. Okay? So that's really been, that part of the process has really been with us now for the better part of a century, that we've had this part of the nomination process where we use primaries. Okay, so we were making the distinction last time between closed primaries, open primaries, and blanket primaries. There's several different types up here. I don't have to go into a lot of detail on these. I want to focus mainly on the closed primary. How far have we gotten with that last time? Does anybody remember what we said?
You mentioned about Texas then.
Yeah, I put Texas in the category of semi-closed or quasi-closed, although a lot of textbooks say Texas is an open. In practice, technically under Texas law, under the Texas Constitution and Texas law, the Texas Constitution specifies closed primary. But political scientists are prone to point out that oftentimes just because something is specified in law with a particular term or whatever doesn't necessarily, in effect, mean that that's what's happening. So that's why I say most textbooks, political scientists who write textbooks on the Texas primary and other, like if you go out and look at, were to do a Google search and find some internet source on, open closed primaries and which states have open primaries and which states have closed primaries, I think many of those internet sources will put Texas in the category of an open primary. Okay? So all I'm really trying to alert you to the fact is I'm sort of on the outs on this, right? Like, most sources will probably tell you Texas is an open primary, but I'm a little uncomfortable with that. I'm going to suggest to you it's really a closed primary, or to be more accurate, a semi-closed primary. And it's because those two basic criteria for a closed primary are satisfied in Texas in one way or another. Okay? Again, I'm sorry, I don't remember how much we said about this last time. And so if I'm repeating myself, I apologize. But in some states, for example, that are closed primary states, you actually have to declare your party affiliation at the time that you register to vote. Okay? And I think that's why most observers say Texas is not a closed primary, because we don't require that in Texas. But I maintain that we do require voters to declare a party affiliation. They just do it at the time that they go to vote in the primary. So if you go to vote in a primary in Texas, you declare your party affiliation when they ask you which party's primary do you want to vote in. Because they're not going to let you vote in both. That's that second one, right? You can't vote in both. In Texas, you can't vote in both the Democratic Party primary and the Republican Party primary. I had a student many years ago. I'll always remember this, even though it was so long ago. In fact, I can tell you exactly the year. It was 1988. And I remember that for a couple of reasons. One reason, it was because I had just moved from Arizona back to the Texas Gulf Coast area. I went to graduate school at the University of Arizona, and I had just moved back and had picked up a class with Houston Community College. I was teaching a course for Houston Community College in Southwest Houston. And I had a student in that class that semester. Oh, the other thing was that it was the reason I remember it was 1988 was because it was the year that George H.W. Bush was running for president. Okay? And I had this student in the class who was really enthusiastic and excited. It was his first opportunity to vote. He had just turned 18. And he was really jazzed about getting to vote for George H.W. Bush. And he wanted to talk about, in the days and weeks leading up to the election in the fall semester, he wanted to talk about the election and so on. And I would have conversations with him. And so the day after the election, we had a class session the day after. And I asked him, I said, I noticed immediately when I walked in the classroom, he was already sitting at his desk. He looked so unusually sedate, at best, disappointed, actually. I said, hey, how'd it go? How was it? He said, I'm not happy. I said, well, what's wrong? And he said, well, my father. I said, what, you didn't go vote? He said, yeah, I went to go vote. I said, well, what's wrong? He said, well, my father told me to go vote in the Democratic Party primary. I think, if I remember correctly, he was friends with a candidate for sheriff. And his father wanted to vote for that candidate for sheriff. So he did that first. Okay? He went to go vote in the Democratic Party primary, voted for that candidate for sheriff. And then he went over to the Republican Party primary, which would happen to be held in the same fire station, right? Just one table here and another table there. He walks over to the Republican. This is what he really wanted to do, is vote in the Republican primary for George H.W. Bush. He walks up and they said, you can't vote here. You already voted in the Democratic Party primary. He was so disappointed. I said, well, weren't you listening in class? We said, it's a closed primary. You can only vote in one of the two party primaries. Anyway, don't be disappointed by, what did I do? Don't be disappointed by the getting turned away, trying to vote in two primaries. Okay, questions about any of that? An open primary is, there's no requirement to declare a party affiliation. I think typically in open primary states, you're still only going to get to vote in one of the two party primaries, but there's no way for anyone to determine which one you voted in. There's no public declaration of party affiliation. Okay? A blanket primary used to be used in several states, kind of an independent voter's dream come true, because the idea of a blanket primary was to allow voters to vote for candidates for both of the political parties, different offices. A voter might vote for a Democratic candidate for the nomination for the Democratic Party for president, a Republican candidate, for the Republican nomination for U.S. Senate, back to the Democratic Party for U.S. House of Representatives. And so, you know, right, could go back and forth. It's the, as I say, the ticket splitter's dream. But that was declared unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court about 20 years ago. And California was one of those states that used the blanket primary. And the basic reasoning of the court, if I remember correctly, was that the blanket primary forces a party to endorse a candidate they may not support. So a number of states like California is certainly one, Washington State was another, they moved to what they call a top two primary. So for example, today in California and Washington, all of the candidates will appear on the same ballot, whether they're Democratic candidates or Republican candidates. And then the candidates who get, the two candidates who get the most votes, they could both be Democrats, they could both be Republicans, or one could be a Democrat and the other could be a Republican. Doesn't matter. But whoever the top of, those are the two that face off in the general election. And then I have the Louisiana primary listed here because it's the only state that does this. Louisiana really doesn't have a primary, to be honest about it. It just, all the candidates appear on the general election ballot. And if a candidate wins an outright majority, then they're elected to the office. But if no candidate gets an outright majority, the top two finishers face off in a runoff election. So most of the states, the greatest number of states, use some version of the closed primary. And before we move away from this into the general election, let me just ask you, think about this from the perspective of the political parties for a moment. Maybe you're a party activist, whichever party you're affiliated, you think of yourself as being affiliated. Imagine yourself in the role as a party activist. Which of these types of primaries would you prefer? From the perspective of your goals and what you believe the goals of your political party are. I think you would prefer a closed primary, right? And I think that helps us understand why more states use closed primaries than others. Why would you prefer a closed primary?
So you can keep people voting for the same party that they're already voting for.
Okay, say that again?
To keep people in line with what party they're trying to go with instead of.
Are you saying that it gives the party more, at least a little bit more control over who their nominees are? Okay, yeah, I think that's right. At least a little bit. It doesn't give the party total control, but it's certainly more than an open primary or one of these other types of primaries, because these other types of primaries allow people to come in and vote in the party's nomination process. And think about that, that's central to what the political parties do, nominating candidates to run for public office. These other types of primaries, to a greater extent, allow weak party identifiers and independent voters to come in and effectively have a significant impact on who the party's nominees are. And so they're much more likely to produce weak candidates from the perspective of maybe not the most viable candidate in the general election. All right. So if you're a Democrat activist, if you're a Democratic Party activist or a Republican Party activist, the main thing that you're interested in is getting a viable candidate to carry your party's banner into the general election, right, against your opponent, your Republican Party opponent or your Democratic Party opponent, right? Yeah, I think that's probably the best explanation for why we see more states with some version of the closed primary. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just having a little trouble understanding the difference between a blanket primary and an open primary.
Blanket primary and open primary? Well, there's so many variations among these that it's really hard to generalize, and I think that's why it can be confusing. But what the basic distinction, I think, is that in the blanket primary, the voter gets to vote for candidates of both political parties. In an open primary, you would only get to vote in one or the other party's primaries, only the Democratic Party's primary or only the Republican Party's primary. It's just no one would know, at least publicly know, which one you voted in. It's that business about declaring a party affiliation. Obviously, in a blanket primary, even though they don't still exist, they don't exist anymore, you would not declare a party affiliation. There's no mechanism for someone to declare a party affiliation. But in an open primary, you don't do that. A voter doesn't do that, but they're still limited to voting in one of the two-party primaries. So as a practical matter, how would that work? I'm not quite sure. I've never lived in a closed primary state, but somehow the voter would be presented with both ballots, both the Democratic Party ballot and the Republican Party ballot, but they would only be able to cast one of the two. Okay, good question. Anything else you want to ask about primaries? By the way, a lot of textbooks refer to these as primary elections. You've noticed that I haven't used those two terms together until just now so that I can dismiss it. I'm really reluctant to use the term primary and election, with primary as the adjective and election as the noun, although it's very commonly done, not only in the popular media, but in textbooks as well. They'll call them primary elections. They call them elections because they have the trappings of elections. That is to say, voters go into a voting booth and they cast ballots, right? But no one, remember, here's the critical point I'm trying to drive home. No one is elected to hold an office as a result of the voting in the primaries. It's not an election process, it's a nomination process. That's really the main point that I'm trying to drive home. Right? All right. Let's talk a little bit about the general election. Let's move on so we don't run out of time on this. I oftentimes don't leave enough time to really work through all of this stuff. So there's several bullet points up here. Let me just run through them here real quickly. Okay. So once the parties have their nominees, used to say in the old days, after the National Convention, after the Democratic National Convention, after the Republican National Convention. But what has happened in more recent presidential election cycles is that we know who the party's nominees are going to be before the conventions. I think I might have made that point to you last time, right? In fact, the last time that there was really any suspense about who a party's nominee was going to be, we have to go back to 1968. And the only reason that there was some suspense in that election or that process was because one of the major Democratic Party candidates, maybe might even consider to be the favorite for the Democratic Party nomination, Robert Kennedy, was assassinated in a hotel kitchen in Los Angeles, California on the night of the California primary. So when Democrats convened in Chicago a month later, right, to nominate their president, none of those delegates who were pledged to Robert Kennedy are going to vote for Robert Kennedy, right? They've got to somehow, come to some other conclusion, right? So, but even that, as I said, was an exception because it's really been since the 1950s. The television era, I think, has something to do with it, right? During this period from the 1950s forward, we've known who the Democratic Party nominee is going to be and who the Republican Party's nominee is going to be before the parties have their national conventions. That's why I say there's no suspense. So I used to say after the national conventions, but now we find that the Republican Party nominee and the Democratic Party nominee are taking shots, the presumptive nominees are taking shots at their Republican opponent or their Democratic opponent even before the national conventions, maybe as early as March or April. You can remember back to a year ago, we already had Donald Trump taking shots at Joe Biden and Joe Biden taking shots at Donald Trump, even though technically neither one were the nominees of their party yet. Okay, so anyway, once the nominee has effectively been determined, then the general election campaign kicks in. And then on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. So it could be as early as November the 2nd or as late as November the 8th. Voters all across the country. In some states where they have early voting periods, like Texas, even before, right? At any rate, they all go into the voting booths across the vast country that, we're holding elections in the polling places, and they cast their ballots for their preferred presidential, vice presidential ticket. But regardless of what they might think, voting for Trump Pence or Biden Harris, they're not actually casting a vote for Trump Pence. They're not actually casting a vote for Biden Harris. They're actually casting ballots for a slate of electors who are politically committed to cast their electoral votes in a fashion consistent with the popular vote in that state. Yes, sir.
So the popular vote determines the electoral delegates for the.
I don't want to, before you continue, I don't want you to think I'm picking at you, but it really is important to use the right term here. You said electoral delegates, electors. We're not talking about delegates here, we're talking about electors. Because remember, we use that term delegates when we're referring to the nomination process. Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead. The electors. I broke
the
your train of
delegates and the
thought.
electors are separate, or?
The delegates choose the party's nominees. They're delegates to a national nominating convention. We use that term delegates in that context. When we're talking about the general election, we want to use the term electors.
Okay. So if the electors are determined by the popular vote, how is it that the electors in the electoral college override the popular vote if the electors are supposed to be representative of the popular vote?
Well, let me say a couple of things about that. First of all, most of the time that doesn't happen. Okay, I know that we've had a couple of instances in your lifetime in which one candidate has won the national popular vote and another candidate has won the electoral vote. And so when it happens twice in a person's young lifetime, there's a really good chance that you come away with the perception that this happens all the time. Okay? But it's only been 2 times since 1876, and that was in the year 2000 and the year 2016. So it's actually an exception to the process, not the rule. Okay, so that's number one. We're just try to remind yourself of that it's real tempting to think, oh, this can happen, and it does happen routinely, but it hasn't happened routinely. Okay. The second point is you got to try to stop thinking about the national popular vote. And you got to think about state by state popular votes. Okay? You got to think about the popular vote as it occurs in a state. We don't have really a national election, even for the president. We have 50 state elections for the president and in the District of Columbia. So we have 51 separate electoral processes. So you got to think about how the popular vote turned out in Texas. You got to think about how the popular vote turned out in Florida. You got to think about how the popular vote turned out in California and so on. And we're going to look at that in some detail. And once you begin to think about it that way, and we're going to sort of work through the mechanics of that, it becomes a lot easier to understand how that outcome that you're talking about might, even if it's a rare occurrence, it might be possible for that to happen. Okay? The Constitution makes no provision for a national popular vote. In fact, it doesn't make a provision for a popular vote for president anyway. There's nothing in the Constitution about ordinary voters, people like you and me, voting for president. There's this electoral college system that was created. And again, we can talk about why they created that here in just a couple of minutes. But let's get the calendar finished off here real quickly, okay? So in December, the electors meet in their respective state capitals to cast their electoral votes. The votes are then sealed and sent to Washington, D.C., where the new Congress in January, you may remember this was really big in the news in January of 2021. In fact, some of you may remember the date because there was some sort of Capitol storming incident that happened related to this, right? Congress canvasses the votes and certifies the winner, the House of Representatives, of the presidential election and the Senate of the vice presidential election, right? So that's the calendar, so to speak. That's the sort of the broad features of the way that the calendar unfolds: the campaign, the popular vote, the electoral college vote, and then the actual canvassing of the vote in January, right? So we don't know really, technically, until January, who the next president is. Okay? That doesn't stop the news networks from declaring a winner. In most presidential election years, it's on the night of the popular vote. Barack Obama has been elected, the 45th president of the United States, or Donald Trump has been, well, he was 44. Donald Trump has been elected the 45th president of the United States. In this one in 2020, they couldn't do it on election night because Georgia was too close and Pennsylvania was too close and so on, and it took a little while to get all that sorted out. But eventually they declared, even before January 6th, that Joe Biden was the winner of the presidential election. Okay? So even before the electors actually cast their votes, we know who the winner, much less Congress certifying the winner, right? We know who the winner is going to be. And that, just like I said with the nomination process about the delegates, I'm going to say it here with the electors, okay? That fact, let me repeat it. The fact that we know before the electors ever meet in their state capitals in December to cast their ballots, we know who the next president is going to be, tells us a lot about the predictability of the electoral vote. It tells us that, for the most part, the electors vote in a manner that's consistent with the popular vote in their states. All right, let's talk a little bit here, just briefly, about the history of the Electoral College. This institution, this very strange institution, seems to us today, I think to most people will be sort of strange, was a part of the original provisions of the Constitution. And what the original provisions of the Constitution said was that the candidate who gets a majority of the electoral vote, again, what's a majority? Half plus one, right? The candidate that gets a majority of the electoral votes becomes president, and the candidate who gets the second highest number of votes becomes vice president. That's the original provisions of the Constitution. Now, if we were using today's arithmetic, what that would mean, I'll tell you in a minute how we get this number, but let me just put the number out there. First, there's a total in modern presidential politics, there's a total of 538 electoral votes. So the arithmetic is pretty simple. Half of that is 269, plus 1 is 270. So the magic number, so to speak, in modern American politics to be elected president is 270. And just keep that number in mind, because if you understand that that's the objective for the Democratic Party's candidate or for the Republican Party's candidate, it helps us understand a whole lot. Just knowing that helps us understand a whole lot about how they conduct their campaigns, why they campaign in this state more than that state, or take out ads in this state and not in this state. Okay? The number is 270. They're trying to devise a campaign strategy that will get them to that number 270. Obviously, that wasn't the number in the beginning. That's the modern number, right? Why did the framers create this institution? Well, I think there's a couple of things that we can say here. Number one, the logistics of having a national popular vote for president in the late 18th century or the early 19th century, or even through most of the 19th century, would have just been untenable. Think about it. This was an era of communication by horseback. The population was spread out over a wide territory, wide expanse of territory. It just didn't make sense to them to think that you could pull off a national vote, just logistically speaking. But more importantly, I think, is the philosophical matter. And to be quite blunt about it, I think we'd have to say that the framers of the Constitution didn't believe that ordinary voters had the wisdom necessary to make such an important decision. That this should be a decision left to the elite leaders of the various states, the respected elder statesmen, so to speak. And they wanted these people to be able to sit around and deliberate and discuss who would be the best person for this very important position. They understood, they thought that the Electoral College would be a deliberative institution. Again, what I mean by that is that they would sit around and deliberate, and they would discuss, and they would talk about, these electors, who the best person for this job is. Now, I have to tell you that it never worked that way, not even one time. It never worked that way. In the first two elections, there was no reason really for the electors to deliberate. George Washington was the virtually unanimous choice. The hero of the Revolution, the respected founding father. As long as he would accept the job, he was going to be, as I say, the virtually unanimous choice. There was no real competition that Washington had. So there was no reason for the electors to deliberate. Now, when Washington announced that he would not accept a third term, and by the way, permit me the privilege of digressing here for just a moment. I would suggest to you that that's one of the greatest contributions that Washington made to our system of government. We don't think about Washington in terms of the creation of our system of government. We don't think about Washington as being terribly important. It wasn't Jefferson, or it wasn't Madison, or Franklin even, or any of the others who, we often look to as having a real, critical role in the formation of our system of government. As I said, Washington was the hero of the Revolution, the respected elder statesman. But when Washington decided that he would not accept another term as president, that set a precedent that I think is very important in our system of government. The peaceful transfer of power from one administration to the next, which has, for the most part, been observed for the last 200 or so years of our history. Imagine what the kings of Europe must have thought of this man. What's wrong with him? He's going to voluntarily step aside and relinquish control. Think about how it happens in many countries of the world, even today. You don't get a transfer of power in many countries, even in the early 21st centuries, unless there's some bloodshed. And some might say that, well, it came to our doorstep this last January. We did have some bloodshed. But I'm talking about large, like significant conflict in order to get a transfer of power in many countries. Okay? I'm not saying the United States is the only country that has a tradition of peaceful transfer of power. No, I'm not saying that at all. There are many countries that have that tradition now as a result of elections. But certainly it's something that was, very important in the American system. That decision of Washington not to accept the third term. But it also had another consequence. It opened up the election of the president, by the time we get to the election of 1796, to the political process. And very quickly a party system emerges. John Adams, the Federalist candidate, Thomas Jefferson, the Republican candidate. John Adams wins in 1796, but they face off again in the election of 1800. And by that time, you have a full-blown party system. And to be just real blunt about it, the electors were, at that point, little more than party hacks. They were going to vote for their party's candidate. They weren't going to sit around and deliberate. They were going to vote for their party's candidate, either Jefferson, the Republican, or Adams, the Federalist. And that election, the election of 1800, is a very interesting episode in our history for a number of reasons, but just so we don't run out of time here, let me get right to the point. That was an election where no presidential candidate emerged with a majority of the electoral vote. And so by the provisions of the Constitution, original provisions of the Constitution, if no candidate wins a majority of the electoral vote, the election of the president is decided by the House of Representatives, with each state delegation having one vote. Not each representative having one vote, but each state delegation. So in those days, it would have been Virginia would have one vote, Maryland would have one vote, Pennsylvania would have one vote, Connecticut would have one vote, North Carolina, South Carolina, each state, Georgia, would have one vote. All right? And that's exactly what happened in the election of 1800. To be a little bit more precise, the electoral vote ended up in a tie. But the tie was not between Jefferson, the Republican candidate, and Adams, the Federalist candidate. The tie was between Thomas Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr. See, this was the first election where presidential and vice presidential candidates ran as a ticket. And so the Republican ticket was Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. I don't have a graphic in here. Because the electors did not distinguish between votes cast for president and vice president. So Jefferson and Burr ended up with the same number of votes. And that meant the election had to go to the House of Representatives. And let me tell you, it wasn't quickly resolved, because Aaron Burr, being politically ambitious, decided, and having some support, decided that he would wage a campaign in the House of Representatives to become president. And I think it took 36 ballots in the House of Representatives for Jefferson to ultimately emerge as the winner. And it was only happened after 36 ballots because the stalemate in the New York delegation was broken by none other than Alexander Hamilton, who some of you are probably aware was later killed in a duel by Aaron Burr. Not for that particular reason, but they did not like each other on a very personal level. Hamilton didn't like Jefferson either. I mean, they were political enemies. Hamilton was the founder of the Federalist Party and Jefferson the founder of the Republican Party. And if you think that the partisan divisions between Democrats and Republicans today are pronounced, they were at least as pronounced back then, the Federalists and the Republicans. They were very much at odds with one another. So Hamilton didn't particularly want Jefferson, but I think in a choice between Jefferson and Burr, he at least believed that Jefferson was a man of integrity, and he viewed Burr as being a thorough scoundrel, which I guess many historians would probably agree with. So that ultimately led to Hamilton publicly impugning Burr's character, and of course Burr challenging him to that duel, Hamilton getting killed as a result. That happened in London. Okay? Anyway, the election of 1800 is important for that reason, because the election had to be thrown in the House of Representatives. And it highlighted a very critical mechanical failure of the Constitution. That is, the framers of the Constitution did not, as a mechanical matter, did not anticipate presidential and vice presidential candidates running as a ticket. Now, that part of it was easy enough to fix. They fixed that by adding the 12th Amendment to the Constitution. I'm going to let you read the 12th Amendment on your own. But the quick explanation is that under the 12th Amendment, electors now actually cast two ballots. One ballot for president and another ballot for vice president. So you don't have that problem again. But the philosophical failure was still there. Not only did they not anticipate the emergence of the party system and electors behaving essentially as party hacks, but they also just didn't anticipate the democratic forces, lowercase d, democracy, that were already emerging in the United States by the early 1800s. And as I said, this role of a popular vote, they didn't provide for that in the Constitution, but it came pretty quickly. By that time, by the early 1800s, most states were already having a popular vote for president to select the electors. Okay, so that's a brief history. Okay, now let's fast forward to really the 20th century and the present day, because I think the most important thing that you need to bear in mind to really understand how the Electoral College works today is this development of the unit rule thing here. Okay, so what is the unit rule? The unit rule is the practice that's used in 48 of the 50 states in the District of Columbia. There's only 2 states that don't use this mechanism. So let me tell you what it is first, and then I'll tell you which states. Okay. The unit rule means that the presidential, vice presidential ticket that wins the popular vote in a state gets all of the state's electoral votes. The unit rule says that the presidential, vice presidential ticket that wins the popular vote in a state gets all of that state's electoral votes. Anybody know which 2 states don't use the unit rule? Maine and Nebraska. So if we have time, maybe I can tell you how Maine and Nebraska do it. Okay. All right, let's let me do this here real quick. Take this off and do this way. So here's how this here's how a couple of things that we need to know here. All right, so each state gets, under the Constitution, each state gets the number of electoral votes that is the sum of the number of its representatives in the United States House of Representatives and U.S. senators. Okay, so we're going to do it like this. You know that each state gets 2 senators, right? Right? So it's a very simple arithmetic formula, right? The only thing we need to know is how many representatives there are in a given state. So let's start with the most populated state in the country, California. California currently has 53 representatives in the United States House of Representatives. It has 2 senators, therefore California has 55 electoral votes. Right? What's the second? Which state has the second most number of representatives in the House? Texas, right? You know what the number is? Currently it has 36, or in the most recent presidential election it had 36 representatives, 2 senators, so Texas, total of 38 electoral votes. Okay? And we, you know, in the interest of time, obviously we can't do that for every state, but if we, you know, just sort of go down in descending order, we're going to find that, you know, Florida, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, they're in sort of the top group of, you know, electors. And then you get down to the bottom with states like North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Delaware. Each of those states has 1 representative, 2 senators, so a total of 3 electoral votes. right? That makes sense? Now, if you add that up, if you take all the states, I thought I had a chart in my slides. I guess it's a different set of slides, but if you add them all up, you make that list starting with California, Texas, Florida, and so on, all the way down to South Dakota, North Dakota, and so on. Add all that up, okay? There's a total of 538 electors. Now we know that each state has 2 senators. So how many representatives are there in the U.S. House? There's 435. I know that you can do that arithmetic, okay? And you know that doesn't come out to 538. So how do we account for those last 3 electoral votes? District of Columbia, okay? There are over 1 million Americans living in Washington, D.C. that have no representatives in Congress or no senators in Congress. They're American citizens. They pay taxes. They serve in the military and so on, right? But because Washington, D.C. is not a state, the Constitution provides for state delegations in Congress. Because Washington, D.C. is not a state, they have no representation in Congress, which is precisely the argument that some people make for statehood for D.C. Do you know that that's a debate that's going on in Washington, D.C. right now? There are people that are arguing that Washington, D.C. should be made a state so these people can have representation in Congress. Well, they don't currently have representation in Congress, but they do have representation in the election of the presidency because by constitutional amendment several decades ago, 40, 50 years ago, whatever it was, the residents of D.C. were awarded 3 electoral votes. That's how you get up to 538. So again, as I said, the arithmetic is pretty simple. Half of 538 is 269. Plus 1 to make that majority means that the magic number to be elected president is 270. Okay, so let's think about this at the individual state level, given everything that we know now. Okay? If the ticket of Donald Trump, Mike Pence wins the popular vote in Texas, what does that mean? That the 38 electoral votes that Texas has are going to go to Trump Pence because they vote as a unit. If the presidential vice presidential ticket of Joe Biden, Kamala Harris wins the popular vote in California, that means that the 55 electoral votes from California are going to go to Biden Harris. And if Trump Pence win Montana, then the 3 electoral votes from Montana go to Trump Pence. That's how that process works. Right? But you can begin to appreciate why they campaign how they campaign. Why, for example, would Donald Trump or any other Republican presidential candidate in the current political environment not want to invest a lot of campaign resources campaigning in Texas?
Because it's almost guaranteed that they're going to win.
Because Texas has been, it still is in presidential elections, a solid Republican state, right? So why would you waste, if you're Trump Pence, why would you waste campaign resources in Texas when you might be able to swing Wisconsin, right? By the way, it works for the Democrats too. Why would the Democrats spend any resources in Texas if they know that the Republicans are going to win? They do spend some resources, but not appreciable, right? Why would the Republicans not spend any money or time in California? Because just as reliably as Texas has been for the Republican candidates in presidential elections, California has been just as reliable for the Democratic candidates. It's almost a guarantee that the Democratic ticket is going to win California in the current political environment, or New York, right? The real questions are in states at least recently, have been in states like Florida and Pennsylvania and Ohio and Wisconsin and Minnesota. That's why they spend so much time and money campaigning in those states, because it's what we call the battleground states, right? Or the states that it's not really predetermined, how the popular vote's going to go. It could go either way, right? So that's where they're trying to influence, the campaigns are trying to influence the voters. Now remember, they're trying to devise a strategy to get 270, right? So if you look at a map, they typically show these maps coded red or blue. You can kind of see some patterns emerging from one presidential election year to the next if we go back a number of presidential election cycles. The Democratic candidates clearly are focusing their strategy on the Northeast and the Pacific Coast, right, and the upper Midwest. Right? And the Republicans are focusing their campaign on the South and the Mountain West and those battleground states in the upper Midwest, right? Okay, so any questions about that point? Now, before I run out of time, let me just say this, because this is a point that I think people oftentimes really don't get, and it's understandable why they don't get it. In fact, I have people ask me from time to time, well, why, how do we know that those 55 electors from California are going to vote for the Democratic candidate? How do we know that the 38 from Texas are going to vote for the Republican candidate? So here's the quick answer. In each state that's running, well, let me take just Texas to illustrate this point. Each political party that's running a presidential, vice presidential candidate, a presidential, vice presidential ticket in Texas, that's on the ballot, and that's going to include the Democrats and the Republicans and maybe libertarians and so on, right? So let's focus on the Democrats and the Republicans. We know that there's going to be a Democratic ticket on the ballot in Texas. We know that there's going to be a Republican ticket on the ballot in Texas, right? The state Democratic Party selects 38 people as electors. The state Republican Party selects 38 different people to be electors. In the event that their party's candidates win the popular vote in Texas, the 38 electors selected by the Texas Republican Party are going to go to Austin in December to cast their ballots for president and vice president. In California, the California Democratic Party selects 55 people. The California Republican Party selects 55 people. In the event that the Democratic candidate wins the popular vote in California, the 55 people selected by the California Democratic Party are going to go to Sacramento to cast their ballots in December. Does that give you a hint as to why the vote is so predictable? The 38 people who cast their ballots last December for the electors from Texas were Republicans. They want to vote for Donald Trump. They're not about to change their vote. And by the way, in addition to the fact that they just want to do it because they're lifelong Republicans, right? It's not a secret ballot. It's a public record. And we know who these people are and how they vote. And so if they ever want to continue to play a role in the processes of their party, they're not going to switch their vote. Okay? They're selected because they can be trusted to cast the vote the way that they're supposed to vote. I used to say up until the 2016 election, from 1960 to 2016, let me do a quick count here. How many presidential elections is that? Let's see. 60, 64, 68, 72, 76, 80, 84, 88, 92, 96, 2000, 2004, 2008, 2012. That's 14 presidential elections. Somebody can do the arithmetic in your head. Multiply 14 times 538. So 538 electoral votes in each presidential election, right? Comes out to what, about 7,000 something? 7,000 electoral votes cast in that period of time from 1960 to 2012. You know how many electors cast their votes in a fashion that was inconsistent with the popular vote of their states? We could count them on one hand. Out of 7,000 votes, 5 that did not vote in a manner that's consistent with the popular vote in their state. That's how predictable that vote has been. Along comes 2016. I think there were a total of 11 just in the 2016 election. And that may have more to do with Donald Trump than anything else. Even though some of them were Democratic electors that were supposed to vote for Hillary Clinton and didn't. Something very odd about a lot of things that were very odd about the 2016 election. That's one of them. That you had just this exceptional result where you still had 530 out of 530 electoral votes, 10 is not that many, but it's double what happened over, the last 50 years, the previous 50 years, okay? So again, all I'm trying to suggest to you is that the electors, the votes of the electors are pretty consistent with the popular votes in their states. And I was going to share some stuff with you here. Let me do this just real quick before you get away from me. I was going to share some results from you from recent presidential elections. Here's the 2020 presidential election, the most recent one. You can see that it's sort of the pattern of presidential election outcomes returned in 2020 to what it had been for most of the period, where the winner of the popular vote also wins the electoral vote by an increased margin. So you can see, for example, that Joe Biden won 51% of the popular vote, but won almost 57% of the electoral vote. That's the usual outcome. To go back to your question, Hisham, we've only had those two instances where, again, in 2000, you had Al Gore, who won a bigger percentage of the popular vote than George W. Bush, but George W. Bush won the electoral vote. And then in 2016, of course, you had Hillary Clinton win the popular vote, 48% to 46%, and Donald Trump wins by what he called a landslide. Interesting, because that's exactly the same number of electoral votes that Joe Biden got in the 2020 election. Okay, we're out of time. We will move on to new stuff on Tuesday. Have a nice weekend.